Well, look, thank you so much for coming on to this live cast today. I'm really excited about what you're going to learn today. And so I just want to get straight into it. We've got a lot to cover. The person I'm going to introduce you to today is Paul Counsel. And I'm not going to tell you a lot about Paul. I said a fair bit in the email. And really, Paul is someone who is absolutely passionate about health and has researched this area for many years. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to bring Paul on and let him take it from there.
Hi, Alan.
Hi, Paul. Well, welcome to the call. And you've got a lot of great information for us today, so please begin.
So let me share some screens with you. So I've been working for quite a few years now in terms of trying to sort through a lot of the information that is currently available to us, and it's really looking at the importance of having a certain terrain within the fluids within your body that lead to an optimal environment for your cells to actually function in. And it's one of the sad cases about living in a modern society that is so full of stress is that it's not an environment that actually supports the optimal functioning of cells. And so today I thought I would just give you a really sort of brief overview of some of the things that really need to be in the forefront of your mind, especially when it comes to this sort of acid-alkaline imbalance that's critically important. And as Alan said, I'm not a medical person of any description, so I don't actually make any medical claims. And if we can sort of understand that, it's just something I have a real passion about. But if you think about this notion of the fluids within a body, collectively there's about 45 liters of all kinds of different fluids within our bodies. Now, some of those fluids would be, described as being quite acidic in nature. Some of those fluids are actually quite neutral, and then other fluids are actually quite alkaline in nature. And they all perform a certain function if they're actually operating within their desired or the parameters which work best for them. But when it comes to blood, you've got things like fluids within your stomach, fluids within your liver, and they're very acidic, and because they've got to do a lot of processing, they've got to do a lot of breaking down. But when it comes to your blood is very, very specific, and it actually has to operate within a very narrow range of pH. And it's the pH that borders just ever so slightly on an alkaline state of affairs. And if it moves, outside this very, very narrow range of pH, then it sets up a whole series of environments where things can start rapidly declining. And in terms of the pH scale, we're pretty familiar with 7 being neutral. It's a logarithmic scale. 14 or anything greater than 7 is considered to be an alkaline base, and anything that's less than 7 is considered to have an acid base. But not a lot of people really understand what that means, and it's incredibly important to understand some of the breadth and the meaning of not only a logarithmic scale, but also what does slightly alkaline mean and what does slightly acidic mean in terms of things that relate to health and optimal functioning at a cellular level. So the first thing that we've got to look at is this understanding, well, what does pH actually mean? And it comes from Latin, and it actually means potential hydrogen. So we've got to look at something to do with potential and something to do with hydrogen. Hydrogen is basically H ions. And so really we're looking at the degree of concentration of H ions within any particular solution. Now, when it comes to the blood has a very narrow range of, H ions dissolved within the plasma and the structure of the blood. And that range is maintained between 7.36 and 7.42. Now, that's a really tiny range. And if you have situations where the blood goes outside, that range, either to the downside or the upside, then that really does set up some situations which can potentially be quite dangerous. Too far outside that range, and of course it doesn't sustain life at all. And you've got to think about, why is all of this important? And it really is important for a couple of functions. I mean, there's lots of functions, but mainly for two. The first thing that we've got to do is understand that pH is a controlling mechanism, and it controls basically every biochemical function within the body, and it controls every bioelectrical function within the body. So pH becomes incredibly important. And what it does is it really controls the speed at which these biochemical processes work. And it controls the speed at which our bioelectrical functions work. And so now it's really important to understand this notion of control of the speed at which a process works. It also controls enzyme activity, and it literally controls the way that electricity actually flows in and out throughout the body. And of course, that's the messaging system. So if we have what we can call an alkaline pH, which means that it's going to be greater than 7. Now, when you have a pH that's alkaline, it means that the environment or the speed at which things are happening are actually going to be slower, because an alkaline energy is actually a cooler form of energy than an acid energy. Not only is it a cooler form of energy, it's actually a slower energy. And so we really want a body to be based on, cool energies and slow energies, as opposed to an acid pH. An acid pH is energy that's really fast, and it's quite hot, and it's quite instantaneous. And so when you measure the pH of a fluid, if you've got a higher concentration of H ions, that means that the amount of activity, or the amount of chemical flow, or the amount of chemical activity, the amount of electrical flow that can actually go through that fluid is going to meet with more resistance, because there's more H ion particles for that to bump into. So it's going to be a slower process. And if you have an absence or a relative absence of H ions in a fluid, then the electricity and the enzyme activity and the biochemical activity, there's going to be less resistance, because there's less particles in that fluid, there's less particles in suspension, so the speed at which something happens is going to be quicker. So the important thing to understand is that alkaline is cool and slow, whereas acid is hot and fast. And then we'll see how this sort of, starts to translate into what's happening inside a body. So what we understand is that the higher or more alkaline the pH is, then there's more electrical resistance within a substance or a solution. And because there's more resistance, then the electrical activity that's taking place within that substance is actually slower. Now, when we apply that to, let's say, activity that's taking place within the fluids of the body, and especially within the fluid called blood, then the electrical activity or the chemical activity is going to be slower. Therefore, there's going to be less aging, there's going to be less burnout, there's going to be less oxidative damage or oxidative stress, which means that there's going to be less evidence of that sort of oxidative damage or oxidative stress on things like the skin, which means that there's going to be, less wrinkles and less visible signs. And that's what we want. We want to slow the aging process down. And when you move into a sort of a higher acid environment, then that speeds the aging process up. So it's really important to understand that all biochemical reactions and electrical reactions, which basically form life, are actually under the control of pH. And if we look at a car battery, for example, a car battery needs to be able to release its energy very, very quickly. When you get in your car and you turn that car over and basically you make a connection with the battery, then the battery has to turn the engine over. And if you think about, an engine with all of its moving parts, when it's in a stationary position, there's lots of friction that it has to overcome in order to start turning over and cranking. And so in order to move all of that machinery, there needs to be a tremendous surge of power. And that surge of power literally comes from an acid battery. And the reason why it's a surge of power, because an acid pH or an acid solution will release its energy very, very quickly, and it's very, very powerful. Now, when you apply that to a body, then if you've got a body that's based on, an acidic environment, then it's releasing its power very, very quickly, and it's running very, very, it's running at a hotter temperature because it's releasing its energy faster. Now, that equates to rapid aging. And if you think about, let's say, an alkaline battery, and if you think about perhaps a torch, now, in comparison to an acid battery, if you turn an acid battery on and your car doesn't actually turn over and recharge the battery, then the battery is going to be flattened very, very, very quickly, in a matter of minutes. But if you, let's say, leave your torch light on, then that torch can continue releasing its energy, and you can have light for hours and hours and hours at a time, because the energy in an alkaline environment is released very, very slowly, and it's very cool. And so when you apply that to the body, then alkaline energy is actually much more longer lasting. And so when you talk about biochemical processes and bioelectrical processes, then we're really talking about a system that is running very, very cool, very, very slow. It's releasing its power. We call that longevity. And so that's one of the major things to start understanding, is that the higher the pH, the more alkaline and oxygen-rich your blood is. And there's another little third thing that the blood, the pH does. It actually controls the amount of oxygen that can actually be, or the amount of oxygen richness that the blood can, absorb. Oxygen is of course carried by the hemoglobin, but how much oxygen is actually presented to the hemoglobin is actually under the control of pH. So the higher the pH, the more alkaline. The more alkaline means that the more oxygen-rich your blood is. The lower the pH, which means more acidity, and that means the more oxygen-deprived your system is. And when a system is oxygen-deprived, then it's running hot and fast, which is rapid aging. When it's oxygen-rich, it's operating slow and cool, which is longevity. And so when your blood moves out of pH balance, and now, in this case, it's moving from the neutral zone to the left of our screen, which is into 6.5, 6, 5.5, and so on down the scale. What that does to a person at a cellular level, and then at a body systems level, is that it creates more stress. And when there's more stress created, it starts to lower energy levels, it starts to increase fatigue, it starts to deplete digestion, it starts to promote excess weight gain, because what the body is trying to do with the weight is to buffer some of the vital organs against the acid attack. And so, the more acidic we become, the more automatic weight gain we'll actually put on. You'll also start to feel lots of, aches in the muscles, and you'll have various aches around the body and sort of various pains that really can't be explained. And if that continues, if excess acidity actually continues, then eventually that leads to more serious disorders over time. And so just by dropping, let's say, urine pH below the level of 6, what happens is that the body starts trying to buffer that pH in some way. And just to give you an indication, the electrical speed, the difference between the electrical speed of 6 and 7 is a factor of 10. So things are happening at, if you have a pH of 6, if you have a urine pH of 6, then the electrical speeds that are taking place are 10 times faster than they would be if you had a pH of 7. If you had let's say, a urine pH of 5, then the electrical speeds, the biochemical speeds that are taking place are actually happening at 100 times faster than they would be taking, than they would be going if they were 7. Conversely, if you have an alkaline pH of 8, then you've got 10 times slower than at 7. A pH of 9 is 100 times slower. So it's a logarithmic, and there's a very powerful breadth of range there, which is why it's really important to understand that the blood has a narrow range of 7.36 to 7.42. So when urine pH drops below 6, then it's signaling the body that it's basically under acid attack, and so the body will automatically start to buffer the acid attack of the blood first, and so the blood gets the highest priority. And so what it does is, if that acid pH stays in 6 or lower, then it starts to search the body for a whole lot of buffers that it can drag out of tissues, or it can drag out of organs. If it'll drag calcium out of the bone, so it starts robbing sodium from the stomach, and it starts robbing calcium from bone or teeth or wherever it can basically get its calcium from, and it uses that as a buffer to neutralize basically the acidity of the blood, so that it can maintain its pH within 7.36 to 7.42. And if you don't have enough, let's say, calcium in the system, then it's not going to be able to do a good job at neutralizing the acidity attack, and that's when things start to rapidly fall apart. Because if that condition stays like that, then over the years, people literally shrink because their bones actually get smaller, because they're actually being leached in terms of supplying the buffers that the blood is actually looking for. So in this sense, we're actually interested in 2 pH readings, because there is many different pH readings according to what fluid in the blood that you're actually measuring. But in this case, we're actually interested in the blood pH, and we're interested in urine pH. There are other pHs that you can measure, such as saliva, but that's a little bit dependent on what you ate or what you had in your mouth, and so it's much easier to consider the blood and urine pH. Now, we can't directly measure the pH of blood. As an individual, it's very, very difficult to measure the pH of the blood itself. We'd need complicated technology. But it's very, very easy to have a look at what's happening within the acid-alkaline balance of the body by looking at the pH of the urine, measuring that, perhaps taking notes about that over time and noticing the change. And if we find that it's consistently below 7, then we can do some strategies to move it back up into that slightly neutral 7 to 7.25 range, which would be ideal. So to be considered healthy, remember that the blood must remain within its narrow pH range of 7.36 to 7.44. And if it goes, just even a slight increment one side or the other, then that causes a lot of environments that could eventually lead to this notion of dis-ease. And if it drops below that substantially, or in fact, if it rises above that substantially, what happens is that cells stop functioning at an optimal level. And one of the reasons there is because they can't actually get enough oxygen to function at their optimal level. And remember that the biomechanical, the biochemical, the bioelectrical processes are happening at a faster rate than they actually should be. Now, there's an absolute brilliant researcher throughout the late 1920s and early 30s, and his name was Dr. Otto Warberg. And you may or may not have heard of Dr. Otto Warberg, and if you haven't, then I'd really encourage you to basically get on Google and to read as much as you can around his work. And he won a Nobel Prize in 1931, and that Nobel Prize was based in physiology or medicine. But he won the Nobel Prize for his research on cancer. And now remember that, a Nobel Prize is something that is peer-reviewed, and it's tested and tested and tested. I mean, there's a great sort of process that you have to go through in order to be awarded a Nobel Prize. And he discovered that basically cancer cells cannot live in pH of 7 or above, and that's a really important thing to just be aware of. In fact, Otto Warburg was actually the recipient of 2 Nobel Prizes, and he was actually nominated for a 3rd award, and he really just narrowly missed out on that. But what he really demonstrated was that basically cellular degeneration is literally a disease of cell suffocation. And so when your pH starts to drop below 7, then the saturation of oxygen is not available to the cells, which means the cells actually start to suffocate. And the further it goes below 7, if we go to 6, then that's 10 times less oxygen. If we go to 5, then that's 100 times less oxygen. And Otto Warburg noted that when a cell receives less than 40% of its natural oxygen requirement, it's either got to adapt or it will die. And if you think about, that the discovery that he made is that anything below 7 is where your cells start adapting, and of course, that's not a desired environment. And he talks about the research after research after research where he identified that basically cancerous tissues are acidic, whereas if you look at healthy tissues, they're alkaline. And so when you have, if you just look at this diagram up here, when you actually have healthy cells that are floating in fluid that has a lot of, OH negative ions, then you're going to have really, really healthy cells, and you're going to, have the slowest form of bioelectrical activity and the slowest form of biochemical activity. But when you start stripping out those OH negative ions because of, toxicity or acidity or stress or, just even, diet and lifestyle, then the fluid that the cells are trying to operate with it either in an intracell fashion or, they're swimming around fluids, they actually start to become hypoxic, and then that starts to become very, very toxic to the cell. And if you think about, the splitting off of, OH ions and OH negative ions and H ions, then what we really want to be encouraging is the accumulation of OH negative ions, which are basically done through an alkalizing process. And so Warburg discovered that basically cancer cells thrive in a low pH environment. And remember, in a low pH environment, you have less oxygen, you have faster biochemical processes, which means that something is going to rapidly multiply. and you have faster bioelectrical processes, which means the signaling of the rapid multiplication is going to be faster. And, what happens is that when you start to move into an acid environment, then, the cells start themselves producing lactic acid. And that lactic acid starts to produce elevated carbon dioxide within the blood, and then when there's carbon dioxide present, there's oxygen is not present, and of course that starts to compound. So Warberg came to discover that pH is really the dividing line between health and disease, and low pH means very, very little oxygen is available, which means that the cells are actually beginning to suffer. And so what we want to do is we want to be really conscious of the daily fluctuations in the pH of our bodies, and we really want to start measuring that so we can get into tune with our bodies and what happens either from an environmental point of view, what happens from a dietary point of view, what happens from just a sort of a lifestyle point of view. And so we want to be really experiencing the most optimal level of pH, because then that controls the speed of everything else. And so we want our pH to be slightly alkaline. There's various measurements, but it's somewhere between, let's say, 6.75 up to, you don't want to go much past 7.5. And we want to be checking that on a regular basis, because oxygen follows pH. And so the higher the pH, then the more oxygen-rich our cells and fluids are. And somebody, as I said, somebody with a pH of 7 has 10 times more oxygen in their system than a pH of 6, and 100 times more oxygen than a person that's actually got a pH of 5. And really what Warberg demonstrated was that, that most degenerative conditions have those two things working, that are consistently working within those degenerative states. And one is, of course, acidosis. And the other one that goes hand in hand with acidosis is hypoxia, which simply means the lack of oxygen. And he noted that the lack of oxygen and acidosis are really two sides of the same coin. Where you have one, you will always have the other, because each one is regulated by pH. And so even a small difference in pH can actually translate to a really big difference in the number of oxygen or OH negative ions that are present in your body. And you want to encourage the saturation of OH negative ions, and we can do that by diet, and we can do that. And I'll show you a few slides as we get a bit further on of what that actually means. But what we're really wanting to understand is the importance of pH. And if we look at, let's say, blood that has a pH value of, let's say, 7.45, it literally contains 64.9% more oxygen than a pH with a value of 7.3. Now, that's only a very, very small increment, between 7.3 and 7.45, but it's a huge increment in terms of the amount of oxygen that your cells have available. And, it's only a 10.5% increase in numbers, but it's a huge increase in the amount of oxygen. And that's exactly what we want. It's a huge increase in terms of the slowing down of the aging process. It's a huge increase in terms of the slowing down of the effects of stress. And so maintaining, proper pH with balanced nutrition itself is not a guarantee, but it just means that you actually give yourself every opportunity to head towards optimal health and to, let's say, avoid the slippery slope down into the processes of disease. And so in order to be able to achieve that, every single day we really want a constant supply of good nutrition and good nutrients. And, whilst people have good nutrition, they don't necessarily have a good supply of nutrients on board. And, that's a really, really sort of interesting thing to understand. What's the difference between nutrition and nutrients themselves? And of course, when I'm referring to is, the whole spectrum of vitamins and minerals and amino acids and trace elements and, all of those sorts of things that go together or make the building blocks of healthily functioning cells. And, when you think about what's happening within our modern society, and we can see it everywhere, we can see it in TV programs, we can actually see it on the freeways, we can see it, basically driving home, that, people experience very low levels of energy, and those energy levels are getting lower and lower and lower than they have ever been, in terms of a generational thing. But, people these days, they get exhausted really easily. And of course, what's happening is that, people are burning out faster. But the other thing that's happening is that people are really, really quick to temper. And you've got to start thinking about, well, why are they quick to temper? Then you've got to start thinking about the difference between, the acidic environment that basically gives off its energy very, very quickly. And people basically who are quick to temper, they will be running an acid-rich environment, which really is a degenerative environment. And the fact is that today that, most diets are actually acid-based, and as a society, we're basically running hot and we're running fast, and what we see as a result of that is rises in all things, all forms of rage and violence and stuff like that. And if, with the whole notion of, I think we have this term called something to do with, chill out. And what's that actually referring to? In fact, traditionally it refers to a person that's really now running cool and slow because they've got an alkalized process. So you've got to think about, how we actually got here. Well, every day we can see commercials that basically, say that we should go and grab the, coffee for breakfast, which is pro-inflammatory, which itself is acid, and then we should have eat, burgers and breads and all of that sort of stuff for lunch, which is, again, pro-inflammatory, and basically it's acidic. If you think about, what do you wash that lunch down with? Probably soft drink or coffee again. Basically, they're pro-inflammatory and they're acid. And then what do we do for dinner? We'll probably eat a bit of processed food or sweets or alcohol. They're all based on acid, meaning that they're all pro-inflammatory type processes. Now, the interesting thing about Otto Warburg, and this is a fascinating piece of research, and it was really at the behest of Adolf Hitler, because prior to the war, the Berlin Zoo was one of the most well-known and well-respected and zoos in the world, and he charged a person by the name of Dr. Enderlin, or Gunther Enderlin. And he was a German scientist that was really following the work of Otto Warburg. And he charged Gunther Enderlin to basically keep all of the prized animals in the Berlin Zoo as healthy as he possibly could. And so he really studied the work of Otto Warburg, and he took thousands and thousands and thousands of blood samples and tissue samples from healthy animals and from sick animals and from dead animals, from dying animals. And basically, those tests that he did really confirmed the work of Otto Warburg in terms of the differences in the ranges of pH of those animals. So the healthiest ones had the higher pH, and the sick and the dying ones, their tissues were acidic. And so both Enderlin and Warburg conclusively linked pH with this notion of health and disease. And then each of those scientists, they really set up comparisons, and they set up a few tests so that they could indicate exactly what was happening within the animal. And those tests were based on blood and tissue samples, so that they could then make some adjustments to the diet and the lifestyle of those animals, so that they actually maintained their healthy pH ranges. So it's really important to understand that, we have this blood that's, pumping around our body, and it's responsible for so many different things. But basically it's responsible for carrying nutrients to every single cell, for carrying oxygen to every single cell, for carrying water to every single cell, and then it basically helps eliminate some of the wastes from those cells, and so it transports waste back, and it transports carbon dioxide back, and things of that nature. But when the plasma, which is actually the fluid that the blood cells actually float around in, when it becomes more acidic, in other words, when it starts to move down to its 7.36 range, it starts to change in its mineral and its protein content. And when the blood starts to change in its mineral and protein content, then microorganisms, which are a natural part of the body's system, they actually start to change. Because when your blood starts to change its mineral and protein content, what it's actually doing is signaling to the body that something is out of balance and something needs to be repaired. And if you think about the protein component of cells starting to suffocate, then the function of these microorganisms is to basically come together so that they can clean up the damage to the suffocating cells. Otherwise, those cells actually become toxic. And this is, the work of Gunther Enderlin. And I've got a little shot up there. Basically, what you're looking at is all sorts of, weird and wonderful shapes, but in actual fact, it's the same microorganism. And the microorganism is actually called Mucorrhesmusis. Now, up on the top left-hand corner there, let's say at 11 o'clock, there's just, basically a series of 3 dots. And so if we were to go into a person's body with an electron microscope, we would actually see these microorganisms. We can't see it under a light-driven microscope because they're too tiny at this stage. But we would see these microorganisms. And if you come down to about 8 o'clock, they're just starting to vary in size, and they vary in shape. Some have got little tails. But basically, this Mucorrhesmusis organism is what they call polymorphic. In other words, it can actually change to many, many different shapes depending on the environment that it's in. So the environment is the trigger for whether or not it actually changed shape. The environment is the trigger for whether or not it starts to move out of its regulatory form. And so let's work counterclockwise. Let's come down to about 7 o'clock. We can now see that microorganism under a light-driven microscope. In fact, what's actually happening is that the microorganisms are coming together, and they're actually morphing into a different form by uniting together to become a bigger, more aggressive form of something, because the more damage that's being done internally, then the bigger these microorganisms will morph into, so that they can actually clean up the damage that's actually being done. And when you start to get about 6 o'clock, you start to get real congestion happening within not only the blood, but within some of the other fluids of the body. And so we've got this sort of visible little sort of worm-like creature. It's not a worm, it's just the same form. But what's happened is a lot of those dots have lined up and started to chain together to form an elongated form. And as we go through 5 o'clock and then basically up to 3 o'clock, we move from congestion into an area where things are starting to break down. And if the environment stays acid, then again it starts to morph into a higher life form, because there's more damage being done and it needs to clean up more damage. And when we get up to about 2 o'clock or 1 o'clock, on the top of the spectrum there, that's when it's actually in its most aggressive form, and at that stage it's actually called a sinusite. And I'm not sure whether you can actually see that on your screens, but this is 2 shots of some blood cells, red blood cells, under a microscope, and this particular shot is in dark field. And so we can see, just round cells, and they're perfectly healthy cells, but there's 2 arrows pointing to two blood cells, and they look quite different from the other cells. One cell, it's got all these black spiky things about it, and what's actually happening is that these polymorphic, or these mucorasmuces, are now actually attaching itself to the outside of the cell, and they're now starting to basically clean up the damage. And on the other one, you've got a little sort of disfigured cell, but it's actually got a little creature coming out of the cell, which means literally that the cell, this organism has gone into the cells, cleaned up the damage coming out of the cells, which actually renders that cell, basically useless, because it's now eaten the outsides of the cell. Just on that bottom slide, that's another organism, but the top slide is what happens when you move into an acid environment, and the bottom slide is if this organism comes to life when you move into a 2 alkaline environment. In other words, it's higher than 7.44 or 7.45. So this organism is pleomorphic. It's actually a natural part of the body's natural regulatory system. Now, in their wisdom, modern medicine doesn't actually acknowledge it, and doesn't, it just doesn't acknowledge it, because basically you can't kill it. You can't poison it, you can't stab it, you can't nuke it, you can't, it's there, it's part of our regulatory system. The only thing that you can actually do is, because it's polymorphic, it can morph one way. In other words, it can evolve to a higher life form, or it can actually de-evolve. And the reason why it's evolving to a high life form is because the pH of the environment is acid, which means that cells are starting to die, which means it's got to clean up the cells. And if you re-alkalize the body, then it has no reason to be cleaning up the cells, because there's no longer any damage. So what that organism actually does is it de-evolves back down to its regulatory state. And so that's why pH is incredibly important. So when the pH of the terrain becomes acidic, they evolve to a higher life form, because what they're doing is devouring protein, because the protein itself is actually becoming rancid. And so you can actually have, blood tests, and you can actually see these organisms within the blood. Now, if we, let's say, have a blood test, and we see these forms, then we know that you're basically operating within an optimal wellness environment. But if we start seeing some of these forms, which are the higher life forms, because that sort of polymorphic organism is evolving or morphing into a higher form because there's more damage, then we know that there is some form of inflammation or some form of congestion taking place. And so at that point, you can say, well, okay, look, these are present. What do I need to do to actually back them down back into that regulatory phase? Again, if you start seeing, these other forms, it just means that you're moving into the degeneration stage, the disease stage, which of course is the rapid aging stage. And so depending on, what's actually taking place, and depending on what can be observed, then depends on, how you might approach your process. But the other important thing that I really like to stress is that it's not really important to actually know what's going on. It's really important to know that it does go on, and that you have perfect control over it. And the way that you have perfect control over it is that you alkalize your body, because alkalizing the body gets back into its regulatory state, and you don't even have to know whether it's working there or not. So just, understand that you have absolutely every control over it. And again, the secret is to do with pH. And so it's really now understood by, some of the real leading thinkers that aging itself is really the result of the accumulation of a whole bunch of things. And so it's the accumulation of oxidative damage, and that oxidative damage causes cells to fail. It's the accumulation of acidic environments, and that causes cells to fail. In acid environments, it causes the rapid metabolization, the rapid chemical processing, the rapid signaling of cells. And again, that's all taking place through basically lifestyle, and so it can all be reversed through lifestyle and diet. And so what we want to do is we want to put in a very, very clear 7-step action plan. And that 7-step action plan is really designed to measure and control and improve your acid-alkaline balance, because the more that you get, let's say in this case we're going to be measuring urine, the more you get your urine measurement to be consistently, let's say around the 7 mark, with a just a tiny wee movement either way, then you're going to be absolutely making sure that your cells have the most optimal environment to actually work in. So the first thing that you want to do in our 7-step action plan is to really put together a pH tracking test kit. And so what you want in that test kit is that you want some test strips that literally measure pH of urine. Now, people can get litmus paper, but litmus paper is really very, very clumsy to use. But also, you want the test increments to be at least no greater than 0.25. So other test strips, they measure at increments of 0.5. And if you think about the difference between 7 and 7.5, then it's basically 5 times. And so it's too great a measurement to see what's, it's too long to wait to see what's actually happening within your body. So you want increments of 0.25. And so you can measure, with a great degree of accuracy, but you can also measure with a great degree of speed. And after you get those urine test strips, what you want to do now is have some sort of methodology for recording all of the food and liquid consumption you're doing, let's say over a period of 14 days. You can do it longer if you like. You can do it, in less days if you like. But what we're really looking for is patterns over time. And so, what I had made when I was researching all of this is I had developed a spreadsheet. And in the spreadsheet, it allowed me, basically it was 7 days, and there were 4 weeks in this spreadsheet. And basically it allowed me to track everything that I was actually putting in my body. And so let's look at, again, I'm not exactly sure what you can see on your screen, but basically it's a spreadsheet and it's got lots and lots of boxes in there. And what you do is you record the substance of every single meal that you have, and you record your the pH of your urine 3 times a day. So you record the pH of the urine, the first void in the morning before you actually eat or drink something. And then you record what you ate and drink up until lunchtime. And then you have another void before lunch, let's say before you eat lunch. And you record that in this spreadsheet. And then you record what you had for lunch, and so on and so on. Record what you ate afternoon. And then you have a void, let's say before you have dinner. And so basically you record that. And I'm not, in this first instance, I'm not particularly interested in what you're eating. I'm only really looking at just recording everything that you're consuming, because what we're looking for is not a spike on any particular day. What we're looking for is patterns over day. So just your normal behavior. And what we want to do is have a look at what is your normal behavior producing. Now, here's a little something that I did just over the last month. Now, literally, I'm an extremely sort of busy person, and in fact, I actually live under a lot of stress. And so I decided to do, this little experiment with myself, because, when you're sort of traveling around doing things, you kind of sort of let things go a bit. And so in my little pH tracker here, basically when you record things on, the prior screen, when you record things here, it automatically graphs to a second page. And so you can see that on week 1 here, which is basically the top colored chart, we've got Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and we've got, morning, lunchtime, and evening. Now you can see a reasonably consistent pattern there. And the pattern says, look, there's probably an average there of somewhere around 5.5. It may be, somewhere in there, but basically that's not a good scenario. There's far too much stress. Now remember, at 5.5, then we've got, 75 times greater degeneration processes going on, and 75 times less oxygen. And in week 2, the pattern remained consistent. So basically, I started to have a look at, now, what's the quickest way that I can oxidize this? And I was actually speaking to Alan, and he, showed me that he's got this new product called, Superfood, and it's basically a whole collection of very, very cleverly thought out combinations of foods. And so the only difference I did not change my lifestyle, and I did not change my diet. What I did is, in addition to consuming whatever foods that I was consuming, I made sure that I consumed a quantity of his green superfood. Now, on this particular, superfood, it says that it's literally one serve, once a day. Well, I went a little bit advanced of that because I wanted to make sure that I could actually get a reading. So basically, I took one serve 3 times a day. And this is the results that I got. So you can see the real difference in week 3 to weeks 1 and 2. And really, there's an absolute increase in alkalinity. Sometimes it's spiked up to 8, but basically there's an average there of around 7. Again, I didn't change anything in the diet, so the diet really stayed the same. The only difference that I actually made was to consume this green superfood, but I actually did it either by putting it in the food, or I actually put it into water, and I drank a litre of that over time. And here is week 4, so you can see that week 3 and week 4 are very consistently high. They're just over, perhaps an average of around 7.25, which was, really impressive for me. So that's the first thing that we want to do. And that's the green superfood that I'm actually talking about, because it really is a very powerful set of alkalizing vegetable ingredients. So step 1 is to get yourself a pH tracking test kit and some test strips so that you can start to measure that. And again, you can do the first 14 days just to find out what is normally happening. Now, what we're really looking for is on the left-hand picture there, we've got red blood cells that are actually sticking together. Now, that's because the environment is more acidic than it is alkalized. And on the right-hand side, we're looking at cells that are so much more separated and so much more available to take up nutrients and so much more available to take up oxygen. So on the left, it's an acid environment, and on the right it's an alkalized environment, and the more alkalized, especially within that range of 7.36 to 7.42, that's the optimal range that we actually want to be working at. So step 2 is literally change to an alkalizing diet. And again, an alkalizing diet will mean different things to different people. And without going into the nitty-gritty here, you can basically, there's lots and lots of good books, and certainly lots and lots of information. But the other thing that I want to encourage you to start thinking about is to include into that alkalizing diet as many what they call prebiotic foods as you can. So most people have heard of probiotic. Prebiotic is perhaps even more important than probiotic, but it's not well known. So prebiotics are literally the non-digestible parts of food ingredients. And what they do when they're taken through the system is they literally stimulate the growth and the activity of those beneficial bacteria within the digestive system. Basically, you can swallow as many probiotics as you like, but if you don't have a network of prebiotic materials, prebiotic ingredients for those healthy bacteria to grow on and colonize and eat as their food, then we're not going to get as stronger colonies of the beneficial bacteria, which means that stronger colonies of the toxic bacteria remain in charge of the place. And this is what happens when you've got colonies of toxic bacteria remaining in charge. And this is just another blood sample. So what you're looking at is one drop of blood that's on a slide that's allowed to dry over time, and nothing else happens to it. It's just a drop of blood on a slide, and it's looked under a microscope. And so you can start to see things. But the main thing I want to draw your attention to here is basically that black spot in the middle. So basically we're looking at, you know, the lower right-hand edge of the blood, and so you can just imagine that it's just a drop of blood, and that black spot is right in the middle. And that's an indicator of some rather a lot of congestion that's actually happening within the large bowel itself, and that congestion is toxic because it's allowing you know, basically those toxic colonies of bacteria to flourish, because there's an absence of prebiotic materials and there's an absence of probiotic bacteria. So that's one way we can have a look exactly and see what's happening. So step 3 is we want to start to eliminate all our toxins. And, you know, lots of people talk about, you know, detox diets and all of that sort of jazz, but it's really important to understand that different things detox in different ways. And so it's it's critically important that you think about ways of getting, you know, all those potential heavy metals out of our system. And, you know, we've got heavy metals in smog and pollution, and of course we've got, you know, heavy metals that start leaching out from amalgams and all of those sorts of things. We've got, you know, the toxins within chemicals and plastics and herbicides and pesticides, and, you know, and it just goes on and on and on. So we've got to be able to eliminate those toxins. And again, you may have your own way of doing this. But in terms of eliminating heavy metals, one really good product is chlorella. And really, there's not much difference between, let's say, chlorella and, let's say, spirulina that, you know, people may know about, except for one thing. Chlorella has a wonderful ability to latch onto heavy metals and eliminate those heavy metals from the system. And spirulina doesn't actually have that ability. So again, when you're thinking about detoxifying, so you really want to be using a product that has lots and lots of chlorella in it until you've basically got those toxins out, and then you can, you know, adjust accordingly. The other thing that you might want to investigate is what they call activated liquid zeolite. It's basically brilliant for you know, they're literally dragging out, and it's a crystalline matrix, which means that it can float around the body. It's inert itself, but it gathers lots and lots of these toxins. They get trapped in this crystalline matrix, and basically they're just eliminated from the system. So it's really a food supplement, and it really does help remove those heavy metals and other toxins, and it does it in a way that's really efficient and safe, and really it reduces, or both of them, or, you know, one or the other will help reduce that sort of toxic burden. And here's another example of, let's say, a dried, you know, a drop of dried blood. But the thing that I really want to draw your attention to is that black ring that's kind of sort of on the outside. When blood dries, it actually dries in a centrifugal fashion, which means it rapidly spins. And so when it dries, if the blood is under challenge on any significant factor, whether it's being challenged by oxidative stress or whether it's being challenged by heavy metals and toxins, those patterns will actually show up in the blood. And so in this case, we've got a dark ring. What that dark ring is literally is the toxins based on heavy metals that are actually in your blood. And so when we you know, detoxify, we want to see the absence of those. We want to see the absence of those white spots, and we just want to see a nice, even, you know, pink, healthy matrix. But that's what, you know, chemical, pesticide, herbicide, heavy metal toxicity looks like in the blood. And here's an even worse case of it. We can see that, you know, the dark ring is migrated all the way to outside, which means that they're the heaviest of the metals. We've got this sort of dark ring on the inside, which means that they're more to do with chemical toxins and herbicides and pesticides. But the other thing that we can see is that that the actual blood is fracturing. It's fracturing apart because there are so many different challenges going on. And again, one of those challenges is that there's a mineral deficiency within this blood, and that's represented by those white crazes. And then there's kind of sort of this white patching going on, and that's the amount of oxidative stress that's actually going on. So that's the oxygen-free radical damage that's causing the protein to be stripped out of each of the blood cells. So step 4, we really want to start putting into the system a very broad range, a broad spectrum of vitamins and minerals that do two things. Firstly, they act as nutrients for the system, but the other thing that those minerals do is that they help to buffer any form of acidification that's going on. Because if you think about this whole notion of mineral and vitamin depletion, what that does is it lowers the supply of amino acids that the body has available. And of course, proteins are actually made out of chains of amino acids. And so if you've got a low supply of minerals and vitamins, then you have a low supply of amino acids. And so when the body needs to repair, when the body needs to rebuild some of the proteins, because you don't have the amino acids, because we don't have the necessary building blocks, it will just basically put anything together, but what you end up with is a lower quality of protein. And if you end up with a lower quality of protein, what you end up with also is a lower quality of cellular functioning. And basically, these splits again, it's another drop of blood. These splits, indicate that there's a dearth of nutrient activity going on, so minerals and vitamins and things of that nature. Step 5 is really eliminate stress, and it's one of the major causes of acidification. In fact, stress is acidifying, simply because of the hormones and the chemicals that the stress triggers create. So what you really want to do is get into all forms of meditation, all forms of basically hobbies that really, that drive your passions. Certainly regular exercise, laughter, heart coherence. Getting in and having great conversations with great company. Even surrounding yourself with people who have what I call possibility thinking conversations, and most people have got the absence of possibility thinking. They've got something always to sort of moan about or blame about or to protest about or to, basically complain about. So you want to get out of that environment because they're so stressful for the body, and you want to get into the environment of, possibility thinking type conversations, because they're all very, very powerful forms of stress elimination. And what happens is that we want our blood to return to the picture on the left-hand side here, which is just, all nice and pink, and there's no cracks of white, there's no, rings of black. It's just this nice shade, and it's a healthy, lovely pink. And you can see the slide on the right-hand side where there's an absence of pink. That means that there's an absence of oxygen in the blood. And there's all of these white spots, which means that, the stress levels and the oxidative damage that's going on is basically turning that blood into a mush of what they call polymerized protein. So on the left is what we want to return to. On the right is what, some people have got going on. Step 6 is we really want to increase the Zeta potential. And, if that's a new term for people, it really is just the measure of the electrical force that exists either between atoms or molecules or particles, or in fact cells themselves within the blood. So the Zeta potential is the electrical force that each of your blood cells carry. And we want a higher Zeta potential than a lower Zeta potential. And I'll explain what that actually means in a moment. But when Zeta potential is low, what happens is that one blood cell will have a negative charge and another blood cell will have a positive charge, and they'll actually start to come together. And the more that happens, the more that these cells are actually attracted to each other, the more they start to actually coagulate. And so when blood starts to coagulate, it actually becomes thick. there's a term for it. It's called blood sludge, and of course, blood sludge then puts pressure on the heart, which then can later on cause a whole lot of heart problems, because it's just got to pump harder, because all of the cells are being attracted to each other rather than independently floating around in plasma doing their thing. So Zeta strength literally determines the amount of nutrient and waste that your blood can actually carry. It determines the amount of nutrients and waste that your lymph can carry. And so by increasing the blood's electrical force, or the electrical force of your cells, it really does allow the blood itself to dissolve more nutrients, and it allows the blood to hold more nutrients, which means that they can actually be carried throughout your body and delivered to the cells where they need to get to. And so if you've got blood sludge coming, then the blood itself can't actually dissolve the oxygen. The blood itself can't actually dissolve the nutrients. And that gets us back to, that prior slide where it looked all really, really dark brown and full of whiteness. So if we've got high Zeta potential, then it's easier for the blood to carry nutrients, and it's also easier for the blood and the lymph system to carry the accumulated waste products away to be removed. And so it heightens our ability to detoxify. And what happens is that we want to get back to the structure of the cells on the right hand side, and you can see that top one, they're red blood cells, and they're just basically being photographed down through a microscope in what they call dark field. But you can see that there's this sort of glow of life around those cells, and that's what we mean by Zeta potential. You can see it in the bottom slide too. There's this sort of glow of life, but the important thing is two things to make note of, is that the cells are not jammed up. They're not sitting on top of each other. They're all independent of each other, and they're all full of this sort of glow. That's Zeta potential. And the absence of Zeta potential looks like the slides on the left-hand side here. So you can see that the cells are aggregating. They're sitting on top of each other. The blood is now becoming really, really sluggish. It's not being able to take up its oxygen. It's not being able to dump its accumulated waste. And again, that's just leading to a more toxic environment. And step 7 is to really take on board the notion of breath work. And really, acidic environments, they produce lactic acid, and then lactic acid then elevates the level of carbon dioxide in the blood, which of course is acidifying. And so blood is alkalized through the elimination of carbon dioxide. So every time you take an out breath, then you eliminate acid. But, we're chronic shallow breathers in Australia. And so we really want to take in that breath work so that we can blow off as much carbon dioxide, and of course then that allows the rich oxygenating elements of breath to then start to impact our blood, especially if we're doing steps 1 through to 6. And you can have a look at a book, it's called Oxysize, and Jill Johnson knows that you can consciously breathe away and literally eliminate fat through carbon dioxide, because again, fat is only being accumulated because of the acidity, and if you blow off the carbon dioxide, then basically you're alkalizing your body and the fat goes with it. So breathing programs combined with stretching and muscle sort of tension things, they can really add to this whole business of alkalizing, and the importance of slowing down those bioelectrical and slowing down those biochemical processes, so that we arrive at a blood work that looks like the slide on the right hand side, whereas blood on the left hand side, you can see how it's all chaining, and it's all there's no independence there, which means that, wherever the surfaces are touching, they're not available for the exchange of oxygen or the exchange of water or the uptake of nutrients or anything like that. So with that, I think we'll now just change back to Alan, and I'll get myself there and take any questions if there's any available.
Oh, there are some questions. There are some questions, Paul. That's a great presentation. You covered so much information there. And look, before we get into those questions, I think there's one that I think we need to cover before we cover any others, which is about the Zeta potential. people aren't sure how to increase their Zeta potential. So could you cover that before we go into anything else?
Just if you alkalize, your Zeta potential automatically increases.
Okay, so the other things that you do, such as diet and reducing stress and the oxygenation, it will all
getting
increase
that green stuff, getting that green stuff into yes. So if you think about the Zeta potential is increased, the more up the alkaline scale you go. Zeta potential is decreased, the more down the acid scale you go.
Okay, great. And I just, before I go to these other questions, as I said, we've got some great ones, and I know that we've gone fairly long, but to me that was just awesome, and we've had a lot of great feedback. So let's get into it.
Just on that Zeta potential, if you think about two cells, one's got a positive charge and one's got a negative charge, they'll actually be attracted to each other. If you have two cells and they've both got negative charges, they'll be repelled from each other. It's that repelling is that Zeta potential, and the way that you get negative charges on them is to actually alkalize your body.
Excellent, excellent. Well, look, I just guess I wanted to, before we go on to it, I mean, I love the analogy about the acid battery and so on, but I thought of a metaphor that I just want to talk about just very briefly before we go into those questions, which is just hopefully puts this in a bit of context for people, because the way I saw the cells of the body was like a forest. If you can imagine a pine forest somewhere, and it's and there it is. Now, to me, the pH is like the weather, in the sense that, and how much rain it's been getting, and whether it's nice and green, or whether it's sort of like a bit of a tinderbox. So to me, having that the green superfood and things like that, and the oxygen that you put in and everything, creates this forest where you've got this green forest. Whereas if you've got too much acid, it's like being, after a long hot summer, you've got all of this stuff ready to burn, right? And that's how I see it. And so from there, if I continue that metaphor, obviously we want to increase that we want to increase the pH so that we increase so there's less chance of forest fire, if you like. Now, if we can again continue on with that I see that toxins are a bit like arsonists. They're running around lighting fires everywhere, right? So you don't want arsonists in your forest going around lighting fires, right? And then in terms of the role of antioxidants in the body, they're a bit like firefighters. So you've got this fight on in the forest, and how much, who wins is going to depend largely on how dry the forest is. If the forest isn't that dry, it's not so bad, right? But if it's very dry, then the arsonists are going to get the upper hand. So in terms of, if you've got all these mercury fillings and everything, you really need to get these out, then it's, you really need to, the role of antioxidants is a firefighter. Now, you mentioned some, didn't really cover antioxidants, because I know that you've got you could do a whole other webcast on it. But really, I have put a link there underneath the page about glutathione and boosting glutathione. And it's a bit like putting a sprinkler in every tree of the forest in order to, like when a fire does get lit, then you can actually put it out. Plus, it actually gets rid of a lot of the arsonists. That's one of its jobs, is getting rid of the arsonists. A bit like the zeolite and the other things do, is getting rid of those toxins. So it's really critical. I mean, I think you commented the other day that you can increase all of your pH levels, but if you don't address, if those arsonists are getting poured into the forest all the time, like through mercury fillings and so on, then you're fighting a bit of a losing battle. So does that sort of make sense to you, Paul? Look, I think that let's get into these questions, because people have spent a lot of time here asking these. And there was one here, there was a bit of a theme actually about alkalized water and the filtering of water and so on. So there are a number of questions there, and a lot of confusion. People were basically saying, well, look, some people say it's great to have alkalized water, and some people say no. What's your view, Paul?
You're going to open up a can of worms.
That's
a real hot topic. So let's just go back.
Yeah.
let's just zoom out of life for a minute and think about now, what is the most purest water we can actually get on the planet? Apart from, the glacial waters that, were millions of years away. But basically, it's spring water. And spring water literally comes from the earth and it bubbles up. Well, how does it actually get up there? What forces that water? There's no pump down there sort of pumping it up to the top of a mountain so that it can pop out. So it's following a force. And the force that it follows is called levity. And levity is the direct opposite of gravity. Now, spring water is what they call structured water. And so it's the most structured water on the planet. Now, different molecules, as it bubbles down the mountainside, it picks up a whole bunch of things. It can pick up, any amount of stuff by the time it gets into the rivers, and now we throw a whole bunch of chemicals in it so that it's drinkable. So by the time it's got to the dam, it's what's called unstructured water. And unstructured water, the molecules of water actually expand to pick up all of these toxins, and it becomes unstructured. Now, you can then say, well, okay, let's put a piece of litmus paper or pH-sensitive stuff into various amounts of water. And if you think about, okay, we can do some wonderful little games with water. I can actually take unstructured water, and I can basically change the nature of the water so that I strip out of it its H ions. Okay? So let's say I've got water, and let's just put a figure on it. Let's say that there's 10 OH negative ions in the water and 10 H ions in the water. And if I strip out the H ions, what I've actually got is super alkalized water because it's OH negative. Okay, so now I can put in my little test strips, and hey presto, it'll turn purple. It's that alkaline. And that's a great magic trick. But it's not structured water. It's destructured water. And just because it's alkaline doesn't mean to say it has an alkalizing effect on your body. So I just want to leave it at that. Okay, now, if you say, well, what's the purest water? It's actually spring water. So if you can go and get a decent supply of spring water, and, just about anywhere in Australia you can actually get, now it might take a bit of an effort. So again, if you start, say, well, that's the top of the Rolls Royce is spring water, and now you work your way down. Now, if you think about putting unstructured water into your stomach, then, what's the acidity levels of the stomach? So basically, as soon as it hits the stomach, it's actually going to change the acidity of the water if it's unstructured. So it doesn't matter whether it's had the H ion stripped out of it, it's still going to be acid because it's unstructured.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it sounds like it's almost perhaps another call that we could, because we're talking about structured and unstructured water and so on, and I know that this is actually a very big topic. So understand that the Rolls Royce is basically the water you can get from living organic food. Basically, because that's got structured water in it, and it's that water that follows the law of levity. Spring water follows the law of levity. Unstructured water follows the law of gravity. So it basically pulls us in, it's decaying, and it's rapid aging. Okay. Because I guess this sort of links into other questions that we've had through, which are around the the foods and the charts, and we've had a couple of different questions, and one is sort of like, well, why would we want to take something like the superfood when we can just simply change our diet? And the other one is around because something is, for example, a food is acidic, say lemon juice, doesn't actually mean that it actually is acid forming in the body. So
no.
They're two sort of related things. So maybe they're actually really two questions. So maybe you want to.
Yeah. So what happens is that you don't need actually superfood unless you actually need superfood. But how do you know? So you've got to give some sort of benchmark. And so if you can actually change, if you can make the changes necessary because you've put together a pH tracking kit, and you're actually testing yourself and you're seeing that where these patterns actually lay, and what we want to do is see a pattern over 14 days, because you might have gone to a party the night before, and so one spike here and one spike there is not really that important. But what we want to do is see a pattern over time. Now, if you can change that pattern with your diet alone, then absolutely, that's all you need to be doing. But if you can't, then the superfoods are really, really great in assistance, because no matter how much food or diet you actually consume, you will not toxify just with those sorts of foods, because they don't actually have the structures within them to literally eliminate the heavy metals from our bodies. Some metals are water soluble, some metals are fat soluble. So it's really important, and that's basically where those green superfoods really come into it. So that's on that. Go on.
Oh, okay. Because we also had a question around is chlorella the same as chlorophyll?
Well, in fact, it's not. Chlorella is actually a protein-based organism that actually grows. It's a single-celled organism. Chlorophyll is basically, it's basically light. And so I forget which way it's actually, which way it's structured, but chlorophyll is only one molecule different than hemoglobin. It's just one is based on an oxygen molecule and the other one's based on a carbon dioxide molecule. And I don't know which one, I can't remember which one is which. But basically chlorophyll is actually light, and it's energy. And so basically that's what basically it's the energy of plants. And
that's what we want to be taking in through things
Absolutely.
like, organic food and so on. And I think it's worth saying, I'm a bit annoyed sometimes when I see these sort of supposed studies about organic food and how, they're not that much more nutritious than non-organic food. And I think a lot of the time they're missing the point, in the sense that it's also not what's in there, it's what's not in there. And what's not in organic food are all of the arsonists, all the toxins and stuff.
Yeah,
so,
if we want,
what's the point?
If we want sort of the Rolls Royce of food is, let's say we could say it was biodynamic, and then we can come down to organic, and then we can come down to sort of mass farming. So there's a hierarchy there. Not all foods are all foods. And again, but what you really want is some way of measuring it for you, because otherwise we get into opinions. He said, she said, they said, and who do you believe? And I worked out that I wasn't smart enough to know who was telling the truth. The only thing that tells the truth is what's actually happening in your body. And so you need a way to measure that body, and let's say the pH tracker is a way to measure what's actually happening over time, and it's through the observation of what's actually happening that you can make as many adjustments as you like until you get the result that you want. But in the absence of that, you rely on feelings, and feelings are not a good measurement of what's happening.
No, and I think this comes back to why you said that a lot of these sort of food charts and so on can be a little bit misleading, because, for one, they don't necessarily take into account what actually happens in your body with them. But the ultimate proof is what goes into your body and what it does to your body.
Exactly, because
so
those charts
and just measure it.
Those charts don't tell me what environment your body's in. They don't tell me what your stress levels are. They don't tell me where you work. They don't tell me anything. The only thing that's going to tell me is what's going on is your cells. And so that's why I, went in to have a look at the blood itself, because the blood is the feedback mechanism. It's the ultimate feedback mechanism. The blood can't tell a lie. It can only be blood. Your cells can't tell a lie. It can only be cells. So what we want is a way of benchmarking that, so that we see for our own eyes, and so we get rid of all the opinions. When you find out what's happening to your body, then you can actually make the necessary. You can reach out and get whatever bit of information that you need that works for you.
Absolutely. Okay, great. Well, look, I think we've answered quite a few questions, but look, we'll keep going, because there are still some questions here. Wow, we have a lot of questions. All right. I'm actually going to go right to the top, because I know that there were a lot of questions earlier on, and I think we seem to have lost some of those, but we probably there's one generally about EMF, radiation, laptops, tablets. That one's just come through, and we had a similar question before. So, yeah, did you have any opinion about that?
Well, they're all acidifying.
All acidifying. So,
yeah.
the more that you're around, the more acidifying.
So because they're acidifying because they put stresses on your body. And as soon as the stress response is the same whether it's a bear chasing you through the woods or a dog barking at your heels or somebody tooting their car or an argument or those electromagnetic fields. If the stress response is the same, so it produces, now whether it's low grade or high grade or whether it's acute or chronic, then we can talk about that. But the stress response is the same, and so it produces basically the same hormones, the same chemicals. And if you don't burn those chemicals out of your body, which is basically what the stress response was designed to do, then they actually sit in your body and then they become toxic. And again, the way that you benchmark that is to have a very powerful benchmarking system. And, the easiest and the most, convenient form is to actually benchmark the acidity levels of your urine based, over time. So you want to see those patterns, and then we can start making adjustments once we actually get those patterns. Right.
Okay. Well, look. Essentially, we're pretty much at 90 minutes now, and it's just been wow. So much information there. And we had a question just right at the end there. I think there's about knowing the best time and method for measuring our pH using the pH strips, but I think you pretty much covered that previously.
Yeah, so we want it the first void of the morning, because the thing that produced the first void of the morning was what you ate the night before.
Mm-hmm.
And so then we want to measure that first, and then we want to go through our morning ritual, and then we want to have a void for lunch, because what's going to produce the void at lunch is what you just ate for breakfast.
Mm-hmm.
And then we want to have a void before we have lunch, and then we want to go in, have tea, but we want to have a void before tea, because what produces the reading before tea is what you basically had, during lunch in the afternoon. And so you can see whether there's increases in stress and all of those sorts of things. So void first, record second.
Okay, sounds good. And I guess just to point people back to, Paul's giving you that 7 steps. Part of that, of course, the first step is actually measuring. And so you've got the pH tracker, the link below that you can get that. And you'll also want to get strips that can actually measure in 0.25 increments, which is why I've tried to use litmus paper and all this sort of thing, and it's just not accurate. So you really need to get those strips. If you want to get them from us and you order the superfood, you get $10 off. And that will come up when you actually order the superfood as you order it. And if you're not currently a HoloSync user and you want help with stress, then there's a link to a free CD. And if you want to boost up your antioxidant levels, as I suggested before, boosting your glutathione is a great way to do it, and you'll see a link to that before. So, below as well. So look, I'd really like to thank Paul, and I think I'll just check with you, Paul. I mean, I think we've still got a lot of people online. I think we've answered most questions, but if someone wants to stay on and just ask some more questions, are you happy to stay on for a little while?
Yeah, or? Look, I'll stay on. Yep, sure.
Okay, great. So we just had a question about the technology. So we'll stay on for maybe another 10 minutes to 6:15 our time in Perth, and just answer the last few questions. But in terms, someone's just asking about the technology question. I think Paul answered that. What he basically said is that technology increases the stress level in the body, which is acidifying. So anything that increases stress on the body, and EMFs are part of those, will increase your level of acidity. So you need to deal with that. So are there any other questions? We're basically just getting a lot of thank yous and compliments, Paul. Fantastic webinar, brilliant. Thanks so much. Fascinating stuff. But are there any other questions before we end off? Get the most out of Paul's. I think at the start when I said that I didn't want to introduce Paul because I wanted his stuff to, his content to speak for itself. I think you've well and truly done that. Okay. Well, I don't know if let me just see. Just hold on a sec. Okay. So we've got some questions coming in. One wanted more detail on the water, but I think we'll leave that for now. We've got if detoxifying heavy metals will change pH levels.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, great.
Detoxifying any metal, any herbicide, pesticide. One of the important things to understand is that 50% of your detox capacity is actually in your large intestine. And so that's the thing that you want to detox first, and you start doing that with your prebiotics. And if you think about, the Zeta potential, if your blood is sticking together, you cannot detoxify because there's no surface area on the cells to actually start to take on board. And what actually happens is that the blood won't voluntarily take a toxin on board that it knows it's going to change its pH. So what it will do is it will leave it in situ and basically wrap it up in fat. So we've got to alkalize so that we separate, so that the actual blood's intelligence knows that, well, it can now safely drag these things out, which is why, again, why the green foods are so critically important, especially chlorella, and people can Google and research, or maybe I can talk to you a little bit more about the activated Z-like sort of stuff, because it's a wonderful product.
Okay, excellent. So there's some good questions have been coming through here. Does body heat reflect acid pH? In other words, if you run hot, if you're like a hot person, is that anything there?
No.
No.
Now, look, that sort of leads into the basically the sort of the prana, the Indian. We got 4 body styles, and some of them are hotter and cooler, and I can't get into a hot shower because I have a naturally gregarious body type. And so, I prefer my showers cooler, but I love like hot, spicy food. And so people who tend to have, cooler body types, they need hotter showers, but they can't eat, hot sort of spicy foods. No, that's not got to do with pH. That's basically body type, and I think there's 4.
Okay, no worries. There's a question there about what
that's
pH...
sort of Ayurvedic sort of...
Ayurvedic, yeah.
You move into that territory and you discover a whole world of knowledge. Okay,
great. And we've been asked what pH kit do you recommend, and that's the pH ION diagnostic test kit. So if you go into and click on the link below the products that we recommend, you'll actually find a link there. And as I said, if you buy any superfood, you'll get a link to buy that at basically $10 off. And it will be certainly the cheapest price you'll find around on that, because we really want people to actually start measuring.
In fact, they're not as easy to get hold of as they should be. You'd think every sort of pharmacy code one, but forget about litmus paper, forget about anything that reads greater than 0.25. And I have personally found that those pH ion test strips are the most accurate and the easiest to actually use, because they're based on, they've got a solid plastic membrane that makes them literally easy to dip in and out and to use, and very, very easy chart to read. And so when you get that and you start, populating your pH tracker, you've got the best sort of feedback mechanism or benchmarking mechanism that you can then start to make informed choices and judgments with.
Okay, great. And we've got questions about where to get the zeolite from, and what I'll do is that I'll make that available as well. I've got a source for that, so I can make that available as well. So thanks for that question. There's an interesting question down here about any links between acidity and fertility.
Well, absolutely.
There we go. Easy answer. Yeah. So, anything the body's trying to do, presumably, is affected by its pH, right?
Anything that stresses the body is putting a load on the body, and the body, no part of the body will be functioning at an optimal level when that load is on it. So it won't be oxygenated. Its bioelectrical processes will be faster, which means things die quicker. They won't be as strong. They won't have as much energy. So depending on which end of the spectrum we're talking about, those swimmers might not make it to where they're supposed to.
No, exactly. And that's the same.
In fact, the production of them. Again, this is not wisdom that's held by, the conventional wisdom. It's wisdom that's held outside the wisdom of convention. So you're not going to find your answers within that sort of conventional model, because it's not what they're about. They're about something completely different than what we would consider to be optimizing wellness.
Absolutely, and that I would say you're going to give me pretty much the same answer with weight loss, because I mean there's a lot of what fat cells do and how things and toxins interact with fat cells. I think you covered that a little bit before, didn't you?
Yes, basically. And it all goes back to the environment. So the more stressful the environment, and some people don't even realize that they're in a stressful environment, such as just sitting in front of computers or just in shared workspaces, or even, an introvert trying to work in an extroverted world. It's stressful. And so they're putting, lots of tiny little loads on the body, and every tiny little load on the body causes the pH to slide down to the acidification. The acidification is about, literally the suffocation of cells.
Very good. Yeah, this is a good question. I don't think we really covered this as much as we could have before. Like you talked about coffee being acidic, and we talked about lemon juice, although it is acidic. Its nature, it doesn't create acidity in the body.
What's the important thing to understand is that everything that you consume, basically, it has to find its way to every single cell in your body. So basically, there has to be a transport mechanism, and basically, the blood is the transport mechanism. Now, when it actually takes, let's say, nutrients to the cell, everything now has to find its way inside the cell. And so if the cells are not separated, the first thing that happens is you can't find your way into the cell because the surface area is actually reduced. But if everything, was equal and everything was, hunky-dory, then when all of these nutrients, and they're broken down through the stomach and their constituent parts, and basically they operate a bit like a train. And so, the first one comes along, and there's a little pathway within every single cell that those nutrients can then go into. And so they go into the inside of the cell where they have to find their way to what they call the mitochondria. And the mitochondria literally oxidizes the combustibles of those nutrients. And it's those combustibles that then turn into a unit of energy called ATP. Now, some of those nutrients, they don't combust. So there's some residual processes that are left over, and we call that the residual ash. And so it's the residual ash that's either going to be alkaline or acidic. And as the cells, if you're basically got proteins and sugars and stuff like that, then the residual ash, starches and breads and pastas, then the residual ash is going to be acidifying. So it's not the actual chemical nature of what goes in, it's the chemical nature of after combustion. And so if you take lemon in when it's combusted, it actually is alkalizing, so are limes. But if you take orange in, it's basically sugar, which then means that the residual ash that's left over is acidifying. So it's not necessarily the pH of the food itself, it's what it combusts into, and it's the nature of the residual ash.
Cool, and again...
And of course, that's what we eliminate on a daily basis. It's basically all those collected residual ashes.
Okay. Well, look, I think these questions would keep coming forever if we wanted to, but I think we really need to end there, and it's just been wonderful, wonderful, Paul. So I thank you very much. We've obviously had a lot of great feedback here, and we've just got one last question about including the Q&A. Yes, I mean the whole recording, the whole webcast will be made available as a replay if you've got friends or relatives who would like to watch that. So thank you so much again, Paul, for your time. It's just been awesome, and hope to perhaps catch you on another call in another topic that I know you're an absolute font of wisdom in all sorts of areas. So I look forward to that.
Okay, take care. Thank you. Thank you for
Thanks,
the
Paul.
opportunity.
And all the best. Thanks everyone for coming onto the call. Really great to see you on it, and again, look forward to catching you up on another live cast. All the best, and bye for now.